HOA reported my car for expired tags. Judge tossed it and scolded the cop. HOA Reddit stories. Hey everyone. Welcome back. Today's story dives into one of those classic HOA mess-ups. You know, the kind that makes you question if they're really protecting the neighborhood or just bored with too much power. Imagine this, your car's parked, tags are expired, and suddenly the HOA turns full detective mode. But here's the twist, it doesn't go the way they planned. This one involves a courtroom, a judge who's not here for the nonsense, and a cop who definitely got more than he bargained for. Buckle up, it's about to get spicy. It all started with something as simple as an expired registration tag on the back of a car parked in front of a quiet suburban home. The vehicle belonged to a longtime resident who had lived in the HOA-managed community for several years without any major incidents. The tag was a few months overdue. Not ideal, of course, but not uncommon either, especially considering the DMV backlog and some personal issues the homeowner was dealing with. Still, this minor oversight somehow caught the sharp eyes of someone on the HOA board, who apparently had nothing better to do that morning. The car was parked neatly along the curb, in front of the homeowner's house, not blocking anyone's driveway, not sitting on jacks, not in violation of any community parking rules aside from the expired tag. But for this particular HOA, that was enough to spring into action. A board member, known around the neighborhood for being overzealous when it came to enforcing the smallest infractions, decided this was a serious issue. Rather than first notifying the homeowner or issuing a standard HOA notice, they jumped straight to involving law enforcement. According to some neighbors, the board member actually walked over to the vehicle, snapped a few photos of the expired tag, then immediately filed a report. The HOA sent an official complaint to the local police department stating that a vehicle with expired registration was abandoned on the street and was potentially causing a safety concern. This wasn't just a quick heads-up. The language in the report was carefully chosen to escalate the situation, turning what could have been handled with a simple note into a full-blown legal issue. Within a few days, a police officer responded to the HOA's report. Instead of contacting the homeowner directly or checking for context, the officer wrote up a citation for expired tags. There was no conversation, no knock on the door, just a bright orange ticket placed under the windshield wiper like a scarlet letter. The homeowner only discovered it later that day when they were heading out to run errands. Confused and a bit embarrassed, they looked around, wondering who had even noticed the tag. It didn't take long before a friendly neighbor tipped them off that it had been the HOA's doing. This wasn't the first time this particular HOA board had used its influence to involve police in minor matters. There had been past complaints about noise violations, mailbox decorations, and even the color of mulch being out of code. But involving law enforcement over a car tag, that seemed excessive. The homeowner, frustrated and feeling unfairly targeted, decided not to just pay the fine and move on. Instead, they chose to fight the citation and tell their side of the story in court. What made matters worse was the way the HOA framed their report. They didn't just mention expired registration. They used words like abandoned, potentially dangerous, and suspicious activity. It painted a picture that didn't match reality, especially when the car was clearly in good condition and parked properly in front of its owner's home. The HOA's eagerness to enforce rules had gone a step too far this time, crossing a line between community management and personal vendetta. The homeowner prepared for their court date with photos, records, and a timeline of events. They also requested a copy of the HOA's report and any communication sent to the police. The goal wasn't just to get the citation dismissed. It was to expose the way the HOA handled the situation, especially how they bypassed normal channels of communication and pushed the issue into legal territory. By the time the court date approached, word had spread throughout the neighborhood. Some residents were quietly rooting for the homeowner, tired of the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. Others kept their heads down, not wanting to be the next target. What started as a simple expired tag had now turned into something much bigger. A challenge to authority, a test of how far an HOA could go in its quest for order, and whether or not those actions would hold up when put under legal scrutiny. The stage was set for a confrontation between a resident simply trying to mind their business and a homeowners association determined to flex its influence beyond its bounds. A few days after the HOA submitted their complaint, A marked patrol car was seen slowly cruising down the neighborhood street. It wasn't unusual for police to drive through every now and then, but this time, it was clear the officer was looking for something specific. Residents noticed the car make 2 slow passes, the officer glancing at vehicles lined along the curb until his gaze locked onto one parked in front of a modest, well-kept home, the very same car the HOA had reported. The officer parked, stepped out, and walked around the vehicle. He examined the back, leaned in closer to inspect the registration sticker, then pulled out a notepad. He didn't knock on the door. He didn't ask any questions. Instead, he began filling out a citation. After taking a few pictures, likely for the official report, he slid the ticket under the windshield wiper and returned to his cruiser. From the outside, it looked routine. But to neighbors who knew the context, it was hard to ignore how disproportionate the response felt. The citation cited the expired registration and referenced a municipal code violation, making it seem as though the car was not just non-compliant, but a public nuisance. The language used in the ticket was almost identical to the terms the HOA had used in their original complaint. Words like abandoned vehicle and potential traffic hazard were clearly copied into the report. This was not just a matter of the officer doing a standard check. It was a targeted response driven by a narrative already shaped by the HOA's description. What raised even more eyebrows was how quickly the police responded. In many towns, reports of minor vehicle violations don't get such immediate attention, especially when the car is parked legally and the only issue is an expired sticker. But this neighborhood had a reputation for affluence and order, and the HOA had developed a history of close contact with local authorities. Some suspected that a board member had a direct line to someone at the station. Whether that was true or not, the speed and precision of the enforcement left little doubt that this was far from an ordinary police response. The homeowner found the citation later that day. It was a jarring sight not just because of the fine, but because of the implications. Getting a ticket from the city meant the violation was now officially on the books. This wasn't just a matter of renewing the tag anymore. It was a legal issue, and one that carried consequences beyond a simple warning. The document stated that failure to appear in court or pay the fine could result in further penalties, possibly even a warrant. All of this, for a vehicle that hadn't moved from its regular parking spot in weeks, and hadn't bothered anyone. Naturally, the homeowner felt blindsided. They had received no prior warning from the HOA, no courtesy notice, not even a neighborly heads-up. Instead, their community organization had jumped straight to legal escalation. Even worse, the report filed by the HOA implied they had attempted to contact the homeowner first, which simply wasn't true. There were no notes, emails, or calls. Just silence followed by a police ticket. Feeling frustrated and cornered, the homeowner started asking around. A few neighbors quietly shared that they had seen the HOA president taking photos of the vehicle days before. Others mentioned that during the last board meeting, the same board member who had reported the car had made comments about cleaning up the neighborhood and taking care of violators before they become a problem. The message was clear. This wasn't about expired tags. This was about control. Adding insult to injury, the officer who issued the ticket had left no contact information and had not attempted to speak to anyone at the residence. The citation made it seem like the car had been dumped on a random street rather than parked in front of its rightful owner's home. The language was cold, clinical, and made no effort to reflect the actual situation. It was as if the officer had been told what to write before even arriving on the scene. With the court date now set and the citation official, the homeowner realized this wasn't something they could brush off. Paying the fine would be admitting guilt and giving the HOA exactly what it wanted, another precedent to enforce its will. But fighting it meant standing up to not just the HOA, but the police department as well. It was the kind of battle that most people in the neighborhood would avoid. But something about the way it had all unfolded, the silence, the misrepresentation, the sheer pettiness, pushed the homeowner to take a stand. After receiving the citation, the homeowner spent the rest of the day pacing the living room, alternating between disbelief and quiet rage. What began as a mild annoyance over an overlooked registration sticker had now spiraled into a legal confrontation. They stared at the orange paper on the table, trying to make sense of the cold, impersonal language, and the implication that they had somehow been negligent or even criminal. What bothered them most wasn't just the fine. It was the fact that their own HOA had started the fire and let it burn. Determined not to let the situation slide, the homeowner began the process of challenging the citation. First, they reviewed the ticket closely, noting the date, time, and specific code cited. Then they went online and researched the exact language of the municipal law referenced by the officer. According to the statute, vehicles with expired registration could be cited, but there were several conditions. Most importantly, the car must have been abandoned or inoperable and parked on public property in a way that disrupted traffic or created safety concerns. Their car met none of those criteria. The vehicle in question wasn't junked or broken down. It started just fine, had been driven as recently as 2 weeks prior, and was legally parked in front of the house as it had been for years. The homeowner took detailed photos of the car in its current condition. No broken windows, no flat tires, no signs of neglect. They also took wide-angle shots showing its location in relation to their driveway and other vehicles on the street. It was clear the car wasn't obstructing anything or causing harm. Next, they contacted the DMV and pulled up documentation showing they had initiated the process to renew the registration but had encountered delays due to a mailing issue and some confusion over an emissions check. The DMV clerk emailed them a copy of the pending renewal request and a statement noting that a valid renewal was already in process before the citation had been issued. That piece of evidence was going to be critical in court. With evidence building, the homeowner visited the local courthouse and filed the required paperwork to contest the citation. It wasn't complicated, but it felt strangely intimidating, like stepping into a fight where the odds were already stacked against them. Still, they pressed on, refusing to let the HOA or a disconnected police officer define them as a negligent or irresponsible resident. In the meantime, they submitted a formal request to the HOA, demanding a copy of the report that had been sent to the police. It took a few days, but when it arrived, it was even more frustrating than expected. The report described the car as suspicious, possibly abandoned, and undermining the aesthetic standards of the community. It read more like a moral judgment than a complaint. There was no mention of any attempt to contact the homeowner, no warning issued, no effort made to resolve the matter within the neighborhood first. It was clear the HOA wanted to make an example out of someone. The homeowner read the report over and over, wondering if this was really about expired tags or something else. A grudge, a power play, or perhaps just one board member who had convinced themselves they were the sheriff of suburbia. Whatever the reason, it only fueled the desire to stand their ground. They began organizing their evidence into a file: photos of the car, a printed copy of the DMV correspondence, the HOA report, screenshots of the municipal code, and a written statement explaining the full timeline of events. They also made notes about the officer's actions, how he had not knocked or spoken to them, how the language in the citation mirrored the HOA's exaggerated claims, and how none of it aligned with the actual condition or use of the vehicle. As the court date approached, the homeowner rehearsed what they would say in front of the judge. They didn't want to come off as angry or emotional. They wanted to sound calm, prepared, and reasonable. The goal wasn't revenge or embarrassment. It was clarity. It was fairness. It was about showing that the system had been manipulated by people who treated authority like a toy, and that they, a regular person just trying to get through the week, were not going to let that slide without speaking up. Neighbors started to take quiet notice. A few even reached out with supportive words, sharing their own stories of minor infractions exaggerated by the HOA. One had been cited for having a slightly faded welcome mat, another for leaving a trash bin out a few hours too long. These were not hardened criminals. These were just people trying to live normal lives, now being forced to walk a tightrope of rigid expectations and arbitrary enforcement. The day of the court hearing arrived with an air of quiet tension. The homeowner had spent the previous night reviewing every detail of their case, flipping through their folder of evidence with a mix of anxiety and determination. They arrived at the courthouse early, dressed neatly but not too formal, hoping to strike the right tone. Someone who respected the process but wasn't about to be bullied by it. The courtroom itself was small, one of several hearing rooms in the municipal building. A few other people sat in the gallery, mostly there for traffic violations or small claims cases. When the homeowner's name was called, they stood up, took a deep breath, and stepped forward. The judge, an older man with a no-nonsense demeanor, glanced down at the file in front of him. The police officer who had issued the ticket was seated to the side, flipping through his own notes. The judge asked the officer to present the basis for the citation. The officer, maintaining a composed but clearly rehearsed tone, explained that he was responding to a report from the local homeowners association. According to the complaint, a vehicle with expired tags had been parked in the same spot for an extended period, and the HOA described it as possibly abandoned and a neighborhood eyesore. The judge listened without interruption, occasionally raising an eyebrow but making no comments. When the officer finished, the judge asked if he had personally observed anything about the vehicle to support the claim that it was abandoned. The officer hesitated slightly, then admitted that he hadn't spoken to the homeowner or investigated further beyond writing the citation. He stated that since the vehicle had expired tags and matched the description in the HOA report, he followed standard procedure and issued the ticket. That was the opening the homeowner had been waiting for. When given the floor, they stepped up with their folder and calmly laid out the facts. They explained that the vehicle was parked legally in front of their residence, not blocking any driveways or violating any neighborhood parking ordinances. They submitted time-stamped photos showing the vehicle's condition, clean, operable, and clearly not abandoned. They presented a copy of the email from the DMV showing that registration renewal had been initiated prior to the citation, along with documentation of delays that were out of their control. Then they turned to the HOA's role. The homeowner respectfully pointed out that at no point had they received a notice, warning, or direct communication from the HOA before the citation was issued. They handed over the HOA's report to the judge, highlighting the exaggerated language used in the complaint, phrases like undermining community standards and potential threat to safety, and contrasted that with the actual, observable condition of the vehicle. The homeowner explained that the car had been driven just days before, that they lived full-time in the home, and that nothing about the situation justified skipping straight to police involvement. The judge took a moment to review the documents, scanning the photos and the printed correspondence. His expression grew increasingly skeptical. He turned back to the officer and asked again why no attempt had been made to verify the claims in the HOA's report. The officer offered a vague explanation about relying on community partnerships and following up on complaints in good faith. The judge nodded, then leaned back slightly, pausing as he considered his words carefully. What followed was a pointed commentary from the bench, one that began with a dry but firm observation about how law enforcement should not serve as an extension of neighborhood politics. The judge acknowledged that expired tags were technically a violation, but emphasized that enforcement required context, discretion, and a fair assessment of circumstances. He noted that the language in the HOA's report was clearly loaded with bias and lacked objectivity, and that the officer's decision to issue a citation without verifying key details was troubling. The judge's tone shifted slightly as he addressed the homeowner directly, thanking them for the organized presentation and their respect for the process. He said it was unfortunate that such situations escalated in this way when simple communication could have prevented all of it. He then returned his attention to the officer and reiterated that law enforcement's role should not be to carry out vendettas or personal grievances submitted by third parties without scrutiny. The courtroom was quiet during the exchange. Even those waiting for unrelated cases seemed to pick up on the tone of what was unfolding. It wasn't a dramatic outburst or emotional plea. It was a calm dismantling of a flawed process, driven by the voice of reason in a space where reason often gets drowned out by authority and routine. The homeowner stood quietly, watching the judge process everything, feeling a strange mix of validation and fatigue from the ordeal that had begun with something so small. As the judge continued to speak, the temperature in the courtroom seemed to shift. What started as a routine traffic citation hearing had turned into a deeper conversation about the misuse of authority and the line between civic responsibility and overreach. The judge wasn't just critiquing the specific citation. He was raising questions about the systems that allowed it to happen. He pointed out that while community associations may play a role in maintaining order, they do not possess legal authority, and their influence should not dictate how law enforcement allocates time or issues penalties without proper investigation. The officer, noticeably uncomfortable now, responded with a firm but defensive tone. He stated that community complaints are a routine part of their patrol operations, and that they often rely on those reports to identify potential violations. But as the judge leaned forward and asked whether any photographic evidence had been independently verified before issuing the citation, the officer's responses grew thin. The only evidence he had acted upon were the photos taken by the HOA board member. Images that conveniently excluded any indication that the vehicle was at its owner's residence or in working condition. The judge frowned and asked why the officer had not knocked on the door or attempted to contact the homeowner, especially considering the car was parked directly in front of a home clearly associated with it. There was no reasonable argument presented, just a vague mention of department protocols and time constraints. The judge looked unimpressed and quietly scribbled something in his notes, then returned to the homeowner and asked if they had any closing comments. The homeowner, maintaining the same steady composure, simply said they hoped the court would see that this had been an overreaction, rooted in bias and executed without proper judgment. When the judge gave his ruling, it was clear. The citation was dismissed, the fine waived, and the homeowner's record left untouched. But what made the ruling remarkable wasn't just the outcome. It was the scathing remarks that followed. The judge spoke directly to the officer and stated that while the court respected the work of law enforcement, it could not ignore the obligation to uphold fairness. He said that citing a vehicle based on a single report from a non-authoritative body, especially one with a known pattern of overreach, did not meet the standards of due process. Then the judge's focus turned to the HOA report itself. He read aloud a portion of it, pausing on phrases like potential threat to community aesthetics and vehicle may be harboring illicit activity, asking rhetorically if these were serious legal accusations or just the dramatic opinions of someone upset over a parked car. His voice held no anger, just the calm tone of someone used to cutting through nonsense. He made it clear that law enforcement cannot be used to enforce subjective community standards, and that doing so undermines public trust. After the hearing, the homeowner stepped out of the courtroom into the sunlight, the folder of evidence still clutched tightly in hand. They felt relief, yes, but it was complicated. The experience had left them feeling exposed in a way they hadn't expected. To be dragged into court over a minor vehicle registration issue, and to realize that it was all driven by someone in their own community, left a bitter aftertaste. There was no apology from the HOA, no acknowledgement of overreach, just silence and a quiet confirmation that in neighborhoods like this, order often came with a price. Over the next few days, the story began to circulate through the neighborhood. Some residents who had kept their distance from HOA drama now found themselves paying more attention. A few sent quiet messages of support to the homeowner, expressing their own frustrations with similar incidents, letters about garden decor, complaints about lawn height, even threats over minor fence repairs. Many hadn't realized just how quickly the HOA could involve external enforcement until now. One neighbor, a retired teacher who had lived in the area for over 20 years, said it best over a shared cup of coffee. They want everything to look perfect from the outside, but they forget that real communities are made up of people, not just property lines. That sentiment echoed in subtle ways over the following weeks. More residents started attending HOA meetings. More questions were asked about how decisions were being made, and who exactly was deciding which complaints deserved to be escalated. For the officer involved, there were no public consequences, but there were changes in behavior. Patrols through the neighborhood became less frequent, and interactions more cautious. The message from the courtroom had clearly registered. Perform your duty? Yes, but don't be a tool for someone else's personal agenda. What started with a single HOA report had grown into something larger, something that pushed people to examine the structure of authority in their small community and question the ease with which it could be abused. In the weeks following the court decision, the aftermath of the incident continued to ripple through the neighborhood. The citation had been dismissed, and the judge's words had carried weight not only within the courtroom but beyond its walls. While the homeowner finally felt a sense of justice had been served, the damage in the community dynamic had already taken root. The fallout wasn't loud or explosive. Instead, it was quiet, passive, and deeply unsettling. Conversations became more guarded, Looks exchanged at the mailbox lingered just a second too long, and a general air of unease settled over what once felt like a typical suburban block. The HOA board, unsurprisingly, made no formal statement about the judge's scolding. No acknowledgement of overreach, no internal review, no change in policy. If anything, they tried to act as though nothing had happened. But their silence only confirmed to many that they were unwilling to take accountability. The homeowner who had stood up in court wasn't looking for an apology, but the complete lack of dialogue spoke volumes. It became obvious that the board operated with an air of superiority, one that didn't appreciate being challenged, especially in a public forum. Within a few days, rumors began to spread that the HOA was reviewing parking ordinances and considering updates to community vehicle appearance policies. While no official changes had been implemented yet, the suggestion alone was enough to stir anxiety among residents. Many began worrying that stricter rules would be introduced under the guise of neighborhood improvement, when in reality it was a quiet retaliation, a way for the HOA to reassert control after being embarrassed in court. Tension between the homeowner and certain board members became unavoidable. Passive-aggressive notes appeared on the mailbox, suggesting unrelated violations like overgrown shrubs or light bulb replacement needed on porch fixture. These were the kinds of nitpicks the HOA never would have bothered with before. But now it was clear they were watching. The homeowner kept records of every interaction, took photos, and even installed a doorbell camera just in case. They didn't want another surprise citation showing up without warning. Meanwhile, other residents began reflecting on their own experiences with the HOA. In casual conversations during dog walks or weekend lawn work, people started sharing stories. Minor complaints that escalated too fast, threats of fines over fence heights, warnings about seasonal decorations. Before, these incidents had felt like isolated annoyances. Now, they began to form a pattern. A few residents quietly started meeting in private, discussing whether the HOA had gone too far, and what could be done to bring back a sense of fairness and balance. Some homeowners pushed for changes at the next board election, encouraging neighbors to run for open positions with the goal of reducing arbitrary enforcement and promoting transparency. Flyers were discreetly distributed, emphasizing the importance of checks and balances in community governance. For the first time in years, people began showing interest in HOA bylaws, not out of obligation, but out of a growing need to protect themselves from what the system had become. As for the local police department, the judge's remarks had a lasting effect. Officers who previously treated HOA complaints with unquestioned priority began exercising more discretion. Reports of vehicle violations were now met with follow-up questions, verification steps, and in some cases, polite refusals to intervene unless real safety concerns were present. The message from the bench had clearly echoed through the ranks. Law enforcement is not a private enforcement arm for neighborhood boards with inflated egos. The officer who issued the citation never returned to the street again, at least not in uniform. Whether it was due to reassignment or discretion, no one knew for sure, but the absence was noted. The homeowner, while relieved not to have further confrontation, couldn't help but feel like a target was still painted on their back. Every HOA newsletter, every knock on the door, every email reminder about community standards came with a layer of paranoia that hadn't existed before. And yet, despite the tension, something else had begun to grow: awareness. The quiet kind that starts with whispered conversations and evolves into collective action. It wasn't a rebellion, not yet, but it was the start of a reckoning. The illusion that the HOA always acted in the best interest of the community had been broken. People now saw that authority, even in the smallest of forms, needed to be questioned, held accountable, and used responsibly. The incident with the car wasn't just a story about an expired tag anymore. It had become a symbol of something much deeper about power, process, and the right to be left alone when you've done nothing wrong. HOA 4.